I want to suggest that if we adopt a process metaphysical worldview, we would see complexity, we would see human action, and we would see strategy and organizations, if you might, in a very different light. And that's the main emphasis that I want to place here. Can I just check, Ibrat, there's something that says this meeting is being recorded, and then do I click a continue here?
Yes, please.
Okay, right. It was sort of just covering the screen, so I thought I'd better check with you. I'm still pretty a novice where these Zoom sessions are concerned. So the emphasis I want to make is that how we think about complexity, about strategy, about human action, and so forth depends on our metaphysical frame of reference, so to speak. And so process metaphysics is an alternative frame to what I consider to be the dominant mentality underpinning much of management and organizational research. So let me start with a quote, perhaps. Okay. From the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, reminding us that, you know, a lot of our thinking is inherited through a conceptual order, which we very often are unaware of. And this conceptual order essentially determines or shapes what we observe. It selects and it discards, and it rearranges it in what he calls a subjective order of prominence. So what we consider to be problematic or otherwise is very much framed by this inherited form of the forms of thought that Whitehead talks about. It is this that actually affects what we observe, so that facts are, in a real sense, not impartial. Our observation selects and discards material that it thinks is not relevant, and then it is rearranged in a subjective order of prominence. So essentially, this conceptual order determines shape what we construe as problematic or otherwise, and so, you know, in a sense, this worldview frames our entire outlook on how we see complexity, how we view strategy, how we think about human action and intention, and so forth. Okay, and I want to suggest to you that the dominant metaphysical orientation is one of what I call substance metaphysics. But before I get into that, let me try and give you an overview of what I would like to talk about today. Firstly, I shall outline what this dominant conceptual order is, this neo-Parmenidean worldview that I think underpins much of what the theorizing that's going on in management and organization studies. Secondly, I shall then look at an alternative process worldview. And by process worldview, I do not mean what most people think about when they say processes of. No, in Whiteheadian terms, process is reality. And that's the difference. Thirdly, if we accept that process is reality, then how do we look at social orders? How do we see social reality as being so structured, so orderly, so predictable? How have we come to this? Fourthly, I would suggest to you that in fact, it is actually very mundane coping actions, everyday coping actions that form the building blocks for the structuring of society. Then, when we look at the world from this way of understanding the primary role of human action, then firms and organizations, institutions, society, all the structures, the social orders that we find around us, all of them are no more than bundles of social practices. And finally, if we think about action, human action and coping action as so fundamental, then how do we begin to understand strategy in these, if you might, micro terms? So let me begin with the dominant Neo-Parmenidean worldview. Parmenides lived before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and so forth, about 2,500 years ago. And basically, his emphasis was that the reality is essentially ordered, substantial, and stable. Plato and Aristotle made some changes by acknowledging the possibility of change, but they construed change as secondary to stability. So the world is made up of atomistic successions of instantaneous configurations of matter, and because they are identifiable and discrete, they can then be captured through the medium of language. So we begin to think about language as simply a medium for representing what the world out there, so to speak. And there's a belief that linguistic terms accurately represent the reality out there. Edgar Morin, the philosopher of complexity, the French philosopher, calls this approach the paradigm of simplification, so that disorder, instability, and flux are construed as problematic, complex problems that somehow need to be subdued, to be curbed. Complexity is, like chaos, is viewed as undesirable, as a state in which we are not not good for our living, so to speak. And this is the dominant Neo-Parmenidean worldview. So from this worldview, complexity is a problem of articulation. It's difficult to describe. It is resistant to algorithmic compressibility. By this, we mean that you can't reduce a complex phenomena into propositional statements, short propositional statements, and you have to basically elaborate and re-elaborate in order to try to capture what we are trying to articulate. There is an impossibility to simplify. As Allen and Bolton in this handbook on complexity and management, about 10 years ago now, quoting Alan Greenspan, who at the height of the financial crisis said, you know, our problem is not the complexity of our models, but that the world economy is so complex because it is in a constant state of flux. So the issue then is complexity is context dependent and even subjective. It has to do with the way we perceive complexity. It perplexes and baffles us because this dominant Parmenidean paradigm blinds us to evidence it cannot make intelligible. It doesn't look at, or it's not able to capture certain aspects of it, and so it ignores it, basically. But what if we treat complexity as a primordial aboriginal condition? What if we accept chaos as the pro-generative origin of all things? This is what process metaphysics is really all about. It starts with the assumption reality is essentially chaotic, undifferentiated, fluxing, self-transforming, so that order is at this point absent. It's a blooming, buzzing confusion. The actual world is a process, an undivided movement, a boundless pro-generative totality. Eugene Youyang has a paper written in 1989, which is very interestingly called Chaos Bound, semicolon, there is wonton in my soup. You know, I don't know if you're Chinese, but some of you may have ever taken wonton noodle. Wonton are those lumps of meat dumplings, so to speak. So there's wonton in my soup. There's order in a soup of disorder, so to speak. So as Prigogine, some of you may have come across his work and has emphasized disorder, instability, and uncertainty are really primary conditions. They are not overflows, if you might. They are not the leftovers of order. They are the primary condition. So the universe is formed by disorder in which order floats. Order are simply islands of order in the churning sea of chaos. Now, what happens if we accept this process implication? The idea that process is reality, undifferentiatedness, meaningless, merely, as Whitehead say, merely the hurrying of material endlessly, meaninglessly. What if we accept this condition? Then, unfortunately, it is unlivable. As humans, we need some level of order, predictability, and coherence. So we need to fabricate a surrogate social reality in order to provide us with this, what Karl White calls workable level of certainty, good enough. And how do we do this? Firstly, but not solely, with language. Language, it does not so much represent as it does help us to carve out selected portions of reality. So selected aspects of this reality is carved out in order to, and stabilize in order to help build our social world. So right now, as I'm talking to you, it's quite sunny. It's daylight. And at some point in the future, it will become dark and it is night. So we carve out daytime, night, beach, sea, out of time. We cut days and nights, summers and winters. All these abstract words are basically our own conceptions. There are no clear dividing lines, but there are tendencies, so to speak, that we detect through our senses. Coping actions rely fundamentally on what might be called perceptual sensitivities. Interestingly, yesterday I was just reading an article about how medical practitioners are being taught what is being called the art of noticing. The art of noticing. And who are teaching these medical practitioners the art of noticing? Mushroom pickers, people who pick mushrooms, you know, because they are able to observe fine differences. And this is what's being medical practitioners, doctors are being trained to do, to develop their art of noticing. So effective coping action begins with perceptual sensitivity to environmental. What happens is the environment solicits our attention. The environment calls out to us and say, come to us, come to me, eat me. A fruit says, eat me, basically. So it solicits our attention and it affords us some means of access, so to speak. So what then happens is we develop our senses. We make fine differentiations in the environment. For example, it has been noted that the Inuits in Canada are able to detect over 42 different types of snow. For most of us, I suspect this is our discriminatory capabilities does not go that far. So, but for them, it is a matter of life and death. Therefore, that's the reason why they have developed this this very acute sensing capability. It's about seeking invariance, despite the fact that we accept that process is reality, everything is changing and fluxing. There are different rates of change. So relatively, some aspects of reality are more durable than others. And it is these more durable parts that we anchor our concepts and our ideas. So coping actions, carving out these blocks, so to speak, of reality provides the basis for the construction, the social construction of reality, of social reality. So these coping actions, these everyday coping actions aggregate into socio-cultural practices. And these practices then guide future interactions with the environment. I could go into giving examples of this later if you need about what I mean by socio-cultural practices, but we can discuss this later on. These socio-cultural practices contain a certain way of engaging with the world that Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. Habitus is what, in a sense, almost bodily nurtured and acquired often unconsciously. So Hubert Dreyfus suggests that it is this modus operandi that impels us, so to speak, to respond in a particular manner non-deliberately. Nevertheless, over a period of time, one can see a certain pattern responsiveness, pattern in the responsiveness, so to speak. It's almost as if Dreyfus calls it purposive, but not purposeful. Purposeful meaning that you follow a pre-laid plan, whereas purposive is about in situ responding to the circumstance as you go along. From this idea of coping actions as a building block of the structuring of social reality, we can then begin to realize that firms and organizations are basically idiosyncratic bundles of social practices. Why idiosyncratic? Because basically each firm or organization has its own history of interactions. A firm is nothing more than the firming up of social practices. Each organization develops its own idiosyncratic variant, and this explains the heterogeneity among competing firms. So when we talk about resource-based view and we talk about Barney's Vrin and so forth, how is it that within the same social cultural context there's heterogeneity? Well, the answer is simply because each organization has its own historical shaping influences. So this organizational modus operandi serves as the basis for ensuring a kind of pattern responsiveness when it engages with its environment. In a sense, modus operandi is this strategic impulse, or provides a basis for this strategic impulse. And that is the reason why when Mintzberg and Waters talks about emergent strategy, strategy as a pattern in a stream of actions. Where does a pattern come from? The pattern comes from modus operandi, from this tendency that has been ingrained and inbuilt into an organizational system of responses. Strategic wayfinding then is about engaging extended, intense, iterative, so to speak, cold-faced engagement with its immediate environment, where coping action plays a fundamental role. This coping action, as I have mentioned before, relies on perceptual sensitivity to what the environment affords. It reprocesses it, and then it responds accordingly. Effective coping response aggregates into socio-cultural practice with a modus operandi, and then your strategic wayfinding is guided by this modus operandi in the way it deals with a fluxing, unexpected, and disruptive environment. So in this kind of uncertain and highly unstable operating environment, it is sensitivity to goings on within the environment as responsiveness that makes the difference, not pre-established plans. So essentially, when we are dealing with novel circumstances, for example, with a pandemic that we've been faced with, we are groping our way in the unknown. We are at the leading edge, so to speak, when we no longer know what to do. That is when the real work begins. And when we no longer know where to go, that is when strategic wayfinding comes along. So we have to chart out our journey, or Tim Ingle calls it to know as we go. Not to know beforehand, but to know as we go. So in summary, substance metaphysics views complexity as a problem that needs to be somehow curbed or dealt with. Process metaphysics says complexity is absolutely natural, that is the primordial condition, but unfortunately it's unlivable. Therefore, we need to construct our own surrogate social reality from out of this primordial soup. Coping actions, our unmediated coping actions provide the building blocks for creating social orders. And these aggregate into socio-cultural practices with a modus operandi. They end up into entities, social entities like organizations, institutions, structures, and so forth. And these are merely sustained practice bundles, so to speak. And strategic wayfinding relies on this organization's modus operandi to guide its coping action. And you have to rely on when we are faced with novel, not yet known situations, strategic wayfinding is a way to deal with the unknown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Robert, do you mind stop sharing the slide just so that we can see you better?
Okay. Let me see. Yeah. I shall have to stop share. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. Great. Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to open it up to questions. But first of all, Robert, thank you very much for your insightful perspective. It's very interesting to take a kind of a philosophical view on this, on the notion of complexity, and the implication of it for strategy. What we're going to do now is Andrey and I, we're just going to open up with a couple of questions to Robert, and then we will open the questions to everybody else. Feel free to unmute yourself and turn the video on if you want to ask a question. Equally, if you, for whatever reason, you're not in a position to unmute yourself or to turn the video on, there's no pressure. You can also type up your question in the chat function and we can read out to Robert. Perhaps I could start with the first question. Robert, I mean, it's a fascinating and perhaps somewhat perhaps not non-conventional way of thinking about the world, the processual view. And I was wondering, considering that we have a mix of participants in this call, we have both researchers and practitioners, but if I could start with the research perspective, what would be, what are the implications of this worldview for strategy research? Perhaps a little bit broad question.
Almost 40 years ago now, Tom Peters had a nice phrase. He talked about management by wandering around. I'm in a way, I'm suggesting that you have to be on the ground interacting intensely with the day-to-day going-ons, rather than relying on some large-scale modeling system. Western propensity from Plato and Aristotle onwards has been the tendency is to create a model of the world before we act. Now, this suggests that somehow the world can be modeled, and this suggests that the world is somehow stable enough to be modeled. But if the world is churning and constantly fluxing and complex, you have no creating this model of the world may be impractical, so to speak. So let's remember that throughout the world, there have been many people who have engaged in all kinds of successful endeavors. We are without ever having heard of the word strategy. So it's not it's not this it's not to be it's not universal that everybody every organization, every entity decides to achieve some outcome, has to preset their aspirations and so forth before they actually execute it, so to speak. That's not how all of the world works.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Andrey?
Thank you, Ibrat. Thank you, Robert. I do have a question for you, Robert, which connects to the point you've just made. And it also connects to a couple of points that are running through the chat as well. And finally, it also connects to this big overarching question that we have in the strategy group at Cranfield. As you know, of course, in business schools, the prevailing sentiment is, or the prevailing kind of direction of teaching is we teach people to construct the future, right? And in that sense, using your language to act purposefully rather than purposively. So what does
purposively rather than purposefully?
Well, I think we teach them to do the opposite. We teach them to construct the world through
Purposefully.
intention. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
So exactly. So what does that mean for this processual and complexity-centered view of the world? What do we teach managers now then?
We teach managers what I was saying about how mushroom pickers are teaching medical practitioners.
So noticing.
The art of noticing. Refinement of the senses.
And how does that connect with Ellen Langer's view of mindfulness? The kind of cognitive view of mindfulness.
Whose view? Sorry?
Ellen Langer's, the Harvard psychologist.
Okay. Sometimes I think people use terms. I think it should be called mindlessness, not mindfulness. Mindfulness is full of thoughts.
Okay, fair enough.
It should be mindlessness because you want to be in touch with what's the pristine reality of what's really going on. You know, people do meditation in the Oriental world and in order to catch a glimpse, a touch of that fleeting reality. And to do that, you cannot have thoughts. You have to be there with the senses, so to speak.
Thank you. One more question from me, if you allow me.
Sure.
As you know, a lot of conversations in strategy are about structures, right? How do we structure? How do we restructure? How do we put structures together? How they morph, and so on and so forth. But what does structure actually mean in a process view of the world?
Structure is just ossified practices.
So repetitive practices?
Yeah, ossified practices that have solidified, so to speak. And of course, I'm talking about social structures, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
If you stop practicing, the structure collapses.
Okay.
Just like you go to an infirmary. You know, when I first came to Britain, I was thinking, why do they call it an infirmary? Huh? You go to the infirmary because your body has become infirmed. To make it firm again.
To recreate the structure, right?
Yes, to restructure your body, you know.
It's interesting you say that to Ibrat, who is a qualified doctor.
Oh, is that right? Okay, good. So if you think in practice terms, everything. Look, we all are in buildings at this moment. Yeah, there was a time when these buildings were sand piles or iron ores in mountain. What do you call seams in the mountains. What did we do? We developed practices of extracting the iron ore. We developed practices of combining silica and sand and everything else to make bricks and so forth. And then we build. These are practices. So even in the material world, we construct our world through practices.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Travel, starting from whatever. You know?
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Ibrat, any questions from you?
No, I'm happy to open up to the audience. I can see there are already a couple of raised hands, and I think Barton was first to raise. Barton, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to see everyone, and thank you, Robert, for your talk. It was really refreshing to see the way you grounded it in the philosophical schools. You're not the first to hit this point of a different orientation is required for these times. I work a lot with practitioners. And if I simply told practitioners, you need to notice things more, they would just look at me silly. So I think you're right, but I think we need to come up, for this program to have more traction with practitioners, there needs to be a framework that the practices that need to be reconsidered can be questioned and modified and evolved in a way that, and so my question is, what is your intent in terms of a research vector for this? What are you advising in terms of, what do you see as a research program for what you have proposed here?
Well, do you know, I'm an ex-business practitioner. A business practitioner is less concerned about research. Research is for other people to explain, so to speak. If I'm a practitioner, I want to know what I ought to do, and you say if you ask your practitioners to notice more, they'll probably laugh at you. I will say, hold on a minute. It's not about noticing more. It's about how do you notice more? How does one go about developing this art of noticing? In art, there are terms like artistic rigor, for example. We talk about scientific rigor, but there's such a thing called artistic rigor. If you go to the literary humanities and so forth, if you go to someone like John Ruskin, for example, he talks about the innocence of the eye. Naive seeing. William James calls it pure experiencing. So it's not as if this is entirely something I concocted out of my own. It's there, you know. When Nishida Kitaro engages with William James on this idea of pure experiencing, they are trying to get hold of this idea of noticing, art of noticing.
So how getting rid of how the way that we see the world blocks our seeing the world.
Yes. We have too much culture, to use a term by Otto Pogler. We have too much. Our heads are full of too much symbols.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barton.
Mike, would you like to go next?
Thank you. I've suddenly appeared. My work, I'm looking at the dividing line between the world as we'd like to see it and the world as it is. And in practice, and I thought your presentation was really useful because it helped point me towards a lot of the ideas underlying the problems in practice, where we like to see the world how it is in a certain way, where actually it's much more complex than that. And my question for you is, where do we use your ideas to get people to recognize the false picture of the world they're giving themselves by relying on or by looking for certainty in that world? That idea of they've got that little fragment of certainty in a sea of chaos. How do we get people to recognize that as being a reality, as opposed to the practice that they do, where business schools spend spend a lot of time teaching at MBA, this is the way to do it, whether it's in project management or finance, and those are based on routines. Whereas actually what you're saying, and what I believe, is we're trying to get people to open their eyes to the fact it's not that certain anyway. So how do we use your ideas to promote that discussion and understanding?
Yes, to start with, I try to disabuse practitioners that the map is the territory. Are you familiar with Magritte's "This is not a pipe"? Yes, there's a painting of a pipe, and he says, "This is not a pipe." You know, why? Because the representation is not the reality. That's a starting point. So there is no certainty in reality, and every action that one takes is a wager. It's a wager. It's a calculated wager, but a wager that comes from previous successes in previous coping actions that gives us the confidence of making this wager. The action never guarantees you an outcome.
Thank you.
Sure, I've responded sufficiently, but
I quite understand that answer. Having worked in two different environments recently, one on the continent in the lowlands, where people there are more open to the idea of uncertainty. Whereas I've been working now in England over the last year, and I find they are more driven by to do and get the job done before and they're not really interested in what their philosophical perspective is or what their analytical perspective is. And I see your point about going back to the success they've always had in the past, which leads them to not identify what their weaknesses are. Specifically, I'm looking at organizational learning. And part of the problem of why organizations have crises and disasters is because they do not learn from the past, but they're not open to learn from the past either. So how do we inculcate these ideas that you have so nicely articulated?
I think the threat to the global situation is that we have become seduced by representations, and because of that, we are no longer able to make fine discriminations about goings on in the world, so to speak. The representations that we have are always neat because they are circumscribed by symbols and language and precision. And to add on to that, we love the spectacular. When I say we, I mean, and perhaps I'm taken to task for this, but I mean primarily the Greco-Western world, which has inherited this from approach to warfare from 7th century BC in Greece. We love the spectacular. We love the heroic. We love the dramatic. We don't like the small, mundane, tiny, little, pedantic, small things working at it. We want spectacular results.
So the question really goes for Andrey, is if that is the quest, how do we educate people to look for that as part of this type of program?
Stay tuned for the rest of this webinar series, Mike.
Yes, I will leave that as an open question.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Before we take questions from the audience, I'm just going to read out some questions from the chat.
Can I? Do you want to do it, Ibrat, or should I do it?
Well, I have one in front of me. Maybe I could start with that one.
Go for it.
From Toby Thompson. Toby's asking, Robert, you seem to have quoted philosophers mostly from the continental school, distinct from the analytic school. Do you have a partisan preference for one or other principal school of philosophy in promoting complexity as primordial?
Well, okay. I'm from the Orient. And the Oriental world has a lot more sympathy with this kind, not all continental, but this type of continental world. Let me read you this one line from Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality, where he says that in general, this philosophy of process basically seems to approximate more to some strains of Indian or Chinese thought than to Western Asiatic or European thought. One side makes process ultimate, the other side makes fact ultimate. So I'm an Oriental, and the traditional Oriental thinks in this processual, natural. To us, chaos is natural. And it is, chaos is not only natural, but it is pro-generative, it's fecund. It gives us possibilities. It is not something to be curbed. It is not something to be controlled. It is something to be unleashed, so to speak.
Thank you, Robert. One more question from the chat room, if you don't mind. And this one comes, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing the name incorrectly, but comes from Tobias Palm. And it goes back to the beginning of your presentation, Robert.
Yeah.
And Tobias is saying, thank you for this extremely interesting presentation. How would you say does the concept of inherited conceptual order relate to Jung's idea of collective consciousness, which we cannot escape easily, and which is also based on Aboriginal perceptions of the world?
Yeah, collective unconscious. Yes, I think there is much to that. I don't know enough about Jung's. I know bits and pieces about Jung's work, but I don't know enough about it to make comment. But I think the one thing that Whitehead, for example, makes it clearer to in my view is that it is about collective unconscious, meaning to say it's more societal, cultural, rather than individual. Okay.
Thank you, Ibrat.
Thank you, Robert. Let's take some more questions from the audience. Sergey, I can see you've been holding your hand up for some time. Do you want to go next?
Thank you very much, Ibrat. Robert, that's interesting, and I'm very sympathetic to this perspective about the surrogates. And certainly there are several surrogates which are different from one another. And I think whenever we see a clash between the surrogates, then the hell breaks loose. My question is a little bit different. Whenever I have privilege to teach students strategy, I start with a question, whether they believe that strategy exists. All right, so because many of them come to our courses with the idea, my reality is so complex, my situation is so complicated that there is no way for you to provide me with any tool. Especially this is the case when you teach undergraduates. So they come to your class and say that your teaching is so remote from practice, from reality. All right, so then I progress to the idea that strategy is a set of initial choices which limit our further choices. All right, why do we need that restriction for the further choices? Because we need alignment and we need direction. So connecting your presentation to the presentation of Robert Burgelman, we need to say no more often than we say yes, all right, when we execute strategy. My question is, after your presentation, whether you believe that strategy is possible at all right, because if we embrace the notion of complexity as a normal thing around us, the idea of direction and alignment is doesn't exist anymore, all right, if I understand you right.
You know, I think strategy is an invention of academics. It's an invented concept to explain success. Okay, we on the outside look at what's going on and we say, now, can we find an explanation for what's going on? Oh, they've got a great strategy. You know, it's an explanation. But what organizations, if you're in the organization, what you care about from moment to moment is, how do we get an edge? How do we overcome competitors, supply hitches? How do we markets? That's the question they ask. They don't really necessarily have to ask themselves, what strategy should I adopt? No, it's about, now, we've got this situation that we're faced. How do we overcome this situation? You know, it's great that you can sit back and think about strategic plan. I know that this has become the language, but it is because consultants and everybody else have now imposed this kind of language, this vocabulary on the practitioner world. You know, I ran a business without having ever heard the word strategy. You know, and we competed pretty well. So
I think you just put Sergey out of the job.
no, that it's so instead of us boxing ourselves with disciplines like strategy and operations and stuff like that, we ought to be more concerned about how do we actually get organizations to perform that bit better, to get that edge which other people over the others within the same arena, so to speak. And that edge doesn't always come from some kind of a grand scheme. It comes very often from little minute moments where you take advantage. You know, we in strategic planning and so forth, one hardly talks about timing. Timeliness is very important. Intervening at the wrong time can be a problem. So is there a paper written on strategic timeliness?
To be honest, I don't know. Yeah, there are several perspectives on time, but
no, timeliness, not time.
Timeliness. Certainly, it's a point of competitive advantage. For example, in sport, all right. For example, in martial arts, it's a crucial bit. You know, so
absolutely. You know, I'm an avid fan of tennis. I watch tennis. You know, just the Australian Open just finished. You know, you look at the stroke by stroke exchange. You know how advantage is maneuvered. You know, eventually until you have that advantageous position and you strike. You know, this is how it goes.
May I follow up? If you take the illustration of sport, do you believe strategy exists in those kinds of simple games? For example, tennis, right? So tennis is less complex than social reality, right? So there are rules, there is a space, and there are only two players. Do you think strategy can be applied in those simple
I don't think it's simple, you know. It is again the discernment of that moment the timeliness of that moment, the noticing of that moment, when to actually sorry. Are you familiar with Homer's Iliad?
No, I don't.
Story of the chariot race in Homer's Iliad, you know, where a very interesting name. And
Of course, I do. Yeah, apologies.
Yeah.
I didn't recognize.
yeah. Sorry, Iliad. Antilochus, you know, has a chariot race with Melanus, the king of Sparta, and Antilochus is a young boy. He's only 14, 15 years old, but he and his horses are not as strong and so forth. But he uses cunning, matisse, you know, what Homer calls matisse, cunning, so that he notices as he's going around the circuit that there's one part that narrows down because there was rain the day before, you know, and just at the moment of the final lap, he forces his way, cuts across Menelaus's chariot and holds it, and because it is narrowed down, he wins the race. You know, it's cunning. You know, when I watch Andy Murray play tennis, he uses he's a canny player. He's not like Roger Federer. He's not like Djokovic. He's not like Nadal. They have different strategies, but that's what we call them.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much for the illustrations.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you, Sergey.
Stephen, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you very much. Hey, Steve Phelan, long-time complexity researcher. I really like your notion of firms as bundles of social practices. But I did want to highlight, I think the conversation is maybe a little too extreme at the edges in some ways, and let me discuss what I mean.
Okay.
There seems to be a tendency among some to think that the world is chaotic and therefore any social practices will do, you know, that there's no adaptive nature to these things. And so I would, you know, and you'll probably deny it, but people seem to be moving in and out of this perspective that anything goes on social practices. We just got to notice things, try a bunch of things. So I think it'd be useful to sort of rein the discussion in to say that these things are adaptive, either historically or currently, that, you know, it's not just a random collection of social practices that every firm has, and that gives organizational fields where you have common practices that have worked because the patterns work over time. So sure, the patterns can go out of fit with the environment or the situation that you're in, and you need to be constantly experimenting. But that too has a cost-benefit trade-off. It's not like, let's just wildly throw out every pattern that we have and try everything possibly under the sun because we noticed something. There has to be a discipline of experimentation as well, because that costs the organization just to keep trying new things all the time. And so, you know, I think it would be useful to talk about at the margin, where do we need to start experimenting with our patterns in response to different environmental changes. So one thing I find useful is in the perception literature out of psychology, they've got this notion of surprisals that have come up through perception, that the sensory system responds and recognizes objects. So how do we know something's a dog, for example? Because we have the neurons firing that say this is possibly a dog. And so our body tells us that, you know, this is what this object is, but sometimes we're wrong and there's a surprise where something upsets that perception. And I think the same thing happens in organizations. We run these routines or social practices, as you call them, and sometimes they don't work. And that triggers this search for a better way of understanding the world. So I think it'd be useful to acknowledge that these things are adaptive and actually work most of the time, and sometimes they don't, rather than suggesting that everything is chaotic and these things never work. You know, I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm saying that there's a tendency to slide into that view.
Yeah. I'm not saying everything is chaotic. I'm saying the primordial condition is chaotic, but we use practices in order to rein in, to create some semblance of orderliness and predictability. And practices that do not work die out.
So there's an evolutionary aspect.
Yes, yes. the certain practices, practices come from engagement with the environment, and if they don't work, and the environment gives it a negative kind of feedback, so to speak, those practices will eventually die out. So the practices that are that guide us are those that have already survived, and they give a certain propensity for us to react and respond in a particular manner. And should the circumstance be so novel that this responding is inappropriate, then we have to make those readjustments. Practices are not dead; they are living things.
Oh, I agree.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Stephen.
Stephen. Mike, would you like to go next? And Patrick after Mike?
Yeah, thanks. Robert, that's nice lead into what I was going to ask, I think, which is we have particular coping actions which relate to different ways of carving up the world, different practices. But as you say, from a broadly pragmatist point of view, some of these have been shown to work better than others, and some actually die out. Approaches such as animism or forms of religion, I guess, die out because they don't help us a great deal in our interactions with the world. Now, it is possible to sort of pin down, or some people believe it's possible to pin down particular bundles of actions which have over time proved to be what Lakoff and Johnson would call experiential gestalts. So that they're ways of acting and interacting with the world which are proven in some degree successful. Similarly, you have, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but there's a book by Stephen Pepper called World Hypotheses.
Yes.
Where he goes to Western metaphysics and looks at different hypotheses which have helped humankind to succeed over time, and without which we'd be pretty hopeless in terms of the way we interacted with the world. They happen to be mechanism, formism, organicism, and contextualism. So I don't know which of these is primordial, but I know there are different ways of coping with the world and acting in the world that are more successful than others. And to just relate that to the point about teaching students noticing, one way it seems to me of doing that would be to give them an insight into these variety of perspectives, which is proven capable of coping with the complexity of the world over time. I wonder how you'd react to that.
Let me say that this, and I will use this Western invention of representation through symbols and models and precision of language and mathematics and so forth. These have helped us enormously in our progress. Let's not belittle. I mean, we'll be here without all these things. But they are all predicated on the assumption that reality is relatively stable, so that we can more or less capture accurately what's going on. We approximate it well. Okay, we use what Andrey Bergson calls a cinematographic mode of thought. You know, you take snapshots and you add them all up, and they are approximately good enough to what's going on in the world. But in doing so, there are gaps in between. These gaps in between eventually come and haunt us. So whilst we teach strategy in this strategic planning in this way, we must also supplement this with the art of noticing. And that is missing.
See the language you use there, you said they will come to haunt us. I would argue they may come to haunt us. It's not every practice. Some practices have been fine for centuries, right? the sun rises every morning. You know, it's not like it's going to haunt us one day. Maybe a billion years from now, it might be a problem. But you know, the seasons follow one another. You know, so this is where I'm saying the language slides into this notion that it's always going to be false. It's always going to haunt us. There's always an issue. Yes, you do frame things, and you need to do that to simplify the complexity of the world. But
yeah, my argument is that in order to enable people to notice things, because of course they look at things according to their existing worldview of Weltanschauung, you actually need to provide them with these alternative metaphysics, if you like,
Yes.
and perhaps more than the process one and the dominant one. So there's a variety of different metaphysics which have proven useful to humankind, and teaching managers, decision makers to view the world through those and notice things through each of those different perspectives. And in a sense, each of them reveals gaps in the others. Then we can educate management students to act more appropriately in terms of and I agree with you, it's a matter of picking up on evolutionary potentialities that happen to occur at any particular time.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay.
And just to mention to everyone, you've just met our next speaker, Professor Mike Jackson from the University of Hull. He'll be with us next month.
And this has been a fantastic introduction. I'm really grateful for Robert for setting the scene.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Patrick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, fine. And in a sense, I think I'm following on from Mike and Stephen's comments. There's a kind of mental trap, I think, a sort of false dichotomy that comes into a lot of conversations in the complexity space between as a sort of mirage of total certainty and contrasted with that chaos. And mostly what we're talking about, both in systems theory and in complexity theory, is the space in between. It's neither absolute chaos and it's absolutely not total certainty. So the sort of polarization of it's either this or it's that. Well, actually, it's not. The vast majority is something in between. It's more,
so
more or less understandable. Yeah. It's more or less.
What's the it that you're referring to, Patrick? I'm not clear.
The experience and the reality of organizations doing stuff in a business ecosystem, because we're talking business, a business ecosystem in relation to other organizations, other actors, and the socioeconomic forces that are sweeping across that. So you've got a set of, in complexity theory terms, a set of actors agents who do stuff in relation to one another. Mm-hmm. That's true of a biological ecosystem. It's true of a business ecosystem. And there is an interplay between them. And that is, it's not totally stable, but it's not totally, it's not chaotic either.
No, once you have a system, obviously it cannot be chaotic.
Well, that's kind of the point. I mean, but it isn't totally stable either. Right?
No,
so,
no, absolutely.
Part of the key here is, around your noticing thing, which I kind of agree with. The trick is, and I think this is partly Stephen's argument. The trick is to understand when the models that we are using are valid and when they're not. And there are particular disciplines around that. There are quite, not desperately well known, but I mean, well-tried approaches to doing that. And I think there's you mentioned the map, not the territory, the Korzybski quote. And I mean, I think he's quite good on this. There's another one from him. There are two ways to slide easily through life: to believe everything or to doubt everything. Both ways save us from thinking. And actually, the hard road is the middle ground, where you are moment by moment deciding: are we reasonably sure about what we're doing? Is it business as usual? Is it same as yesterday? Is it the routine? Is it the bundle of practice? Or has that actually dropped out of utility? Has the world changed? Do we no longer fit? Do we have to change? And I think there's particular ways of seeing whether we still have fit or not with the world. And that's really at the heart of strategy in a complexity domain. And I'm trying to understand how that relates to what you're talking about with the processual view.
I don't think it's incompatible. In fact, much of what you are saying, if I can understand, is quite compatible with what I have been articulating, because I am saying that this primordial condition is there before us, so to speak, and that, for all intents and purposes, could be construed as chaotic, but it is unlivable. Therefore, we have to create our own mechanisms for structuring what's there into more livable forms, just like we structure our environment to make ourselves survive better, our shelter and stuff like that. This is how we, and these shelters are never perfect, because you can get a thunderstorm, you can get an earthquake and so forth. Yeah, that's how it's never complete. And so we keep on reinforcing and rebuilding and reworking our fate, so to speak, to use the term. So I don't see that as being incompatible at all.
Okay.
That I have a sense, might be, it's just terminological, but I have a sense in which you think of systems as somehow already there. And for me, systems are part of this aggregation of coping actions that I speak of.
No, I wouldn't see it like that at all.
Yeah.
I wouldn't see it like that at all.
That's how, yeah. That might be where we differ then.
The essence of a systems view for me, I mean, Mike might disagree, but the essence of a systems view for me is the way systems self-organize to create order for a time.
Then I would suggest to you that from where I stand, you are still subscribing to this Parmenidean worldview, which is fair enough,
Don't think so.
I
mean, much more Heraclitus, I would say.
Oh, well.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Good thing about Zoom that it can never disintegrate into a fight.
Intellectual fight, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, possibly. Thank you, Patrick. We are approaching the end of the webinar. And Robert, one final question from me, or what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold two questions into this. Who do you think is doing interesting work in this space at the moment? And also, what are you reading? What books are currently on your desk?
I'm a bit of a gadfly, you see. First part of your question, who is doing interesting work? I actually have been, there's a chap at Oxford called Tipo Phelan, is that his name?
Sure, Tipo.
I think his stuff is interesting. I don't read a lot of management strategy literature. The stuff I'm reading are like ecological psychology. Oh gosh, Tim Ingalls' work on being alive. I'm reading Francois Julian.
Oh yes, of course, yeah. There's the treatise on efficacy.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
I think Julian has his stuff is really
It's very good. Yeah.
Perceptive, very perceptive.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair
Yeah.
enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk and for fielding the questions for 45 minutes. We really enjoyed it, Robert.